Hello, everybody. This is not normal because it's just not. It's a good day outside. You know, the NRBC is about to show up. I doubt there's anybody going to come on here, but I really wanted to make this video to explain things of the brain. This is Prestige. She's my Snyder skink. She's very awesome. This is a 4x4x8 grow tent that my Savannah monitor's in. My Basculus is over here. So this is my zebra skinks. And over here are my Cuban Nightingale babies. He's got a little mohawk going because he's like, oh, I don't understand. So this is Prestige. She's escaped her tote when she was in quarantine twice. So yeah, this is how she'll just be for the hours. So I wanted to explain how the differences in the brain of reptiles shows off the differences. So I have put together models and stuff here off of this, but all of this is based off this study right here by a place in France. Like, I've been playing with this, so as we go down through this data, you can see different numbers and how they change. And I just used a couple of olive skink and fire skink. So I wanted to, it looks like this right now because I wanted to compare these two, olive skinks and fire skinks. So we can see by the data itself a little bit. This represents this. So this is a brain of an animal. This is off that study. This is explaining what part of the brain they're looking at for different numbers. So what we're looking at here is this back end, the medulla and the cerebellum right now. And I've got a whole nother video on medullas. But what the study found was that mathematically only the cerebellum. So when you're looking at a snake cerebellum, this white lump here, it actually legless or reduced limbs folds away from the optic tantrum, whereas a four-legged will actually wrap around the optic tantrum, and then thicker it gets for different stuff. And we see that in the data. So the fire skink has a slightly smaller cerebellum than the olive skink, but the olive skink has a slightly smaller medulla here. And the cerebellum is motions and muscle movements and growth and regeneration and stuff like that. Whereas medulla is sensitive. It's the nervous system. It's the apparatus of which things travel from your nervous systems and such. So the more sensitivity you get in the body, the more likely it is to actually grow that. Because the more it's used, the more it's grown. So this is why the emerald green tree skink behaves differently than the oscillating skink, because it buries itself and grows that medulla. Because if you look at a brain as 100%, then all these different parts equal a certain amount of percentage of the brain. And that makes so much more sense than size. And I will show this. I will absolutely show this is true. Because most time we want to think of a brain as, oh, wow, because it's so much bigger, it's so much smarter. Well, would we consider a whale to be smarter than us? In some ways, probably. So a whale's brain is as different to a shark's brain as a human's brain is from a reptile brain. It is literally that clear of a difference. It's really fascinating. So this is a chart. So I didn't do the medulla and the cerebellum, but we have the OL stalk, the forebrain side, the forebrain cross, and the optic tantrum. And so I have different reptiles here that we used. So when we are talking about the actual OL stalk, so what brings in taste and smell, dissects it in the brain. We are talking about this spots right here. This is a ball python. This is a bearded dragon. This is a bearded dragon. And this is a fire skink. So we're talking about these spots right here. Right below it is the forebrain, the red over here. So when we go over here, we can look. And based off of this study, going off of the different sizes, I've made this chart. So ball pythons, they have a bigger OL stalk than the other ones. But you also think ball pythons are often bigger than a sea snake or a corn snake or a viper, but a viper is actually smaller. And then this is the one that just is flabbergasted me and is so incredibly interesting in my mind. This Cape dwarf chameleon from Madagascar, you will see it pop up. It's 15 centimeters. The Jackson chameleon is like 25 to 30 centimeters long. So the actual Cape dwarf chameleon has a bigger brain overall than the Jackson's chameleon. Have no idea. But we have a collared lizard. The OL stalk on so many of these are super similar. Well, our leopard gecko, fire skink, our glass lizard, our blind species here. And then we have a skink that is the olive skink that's semi-arboreal. So then we can see that the OL stalk has a vast difference. Okay. So yeah, we'll have to look into. So that's really fascinating to me. But yet, I would say the skinks are more active and they actually have more. But the size difference between these guys and these guys are pretty massive. You know, a fire skink and an olive skink. So for them to have just a slightly smaller one than these guys, but I would say these guys are more curious and more active and more creative and they have more thoughts than like this. Like this is not something you're gonna see in a lot of these other animals in this type of manner, not this dramatic. So we'll get back into that. So it's really cool. Even the viper. And I just made a video on the differences between, the heat pits and how their brains work differently. What's really fascinating here. So let's go to the forebrain. This is the forebrain. So this is the forebrain on these. And the forebrain looks so dramatically different. So where the bearded dragon is just a simple circle The snakes often look more like organs, where there's actually stuff presenting there. And then you have the fire skink, which looks like bags. So instead of size, if you look at percentile and then hi buddy. If you look at percentile and then you look at the connections, you can clearly see that the OL stock affects the actual forebrain. So the percentage of the brain in a fire skink is much bigger for the OL stock than it is for a bearded dragon. But the size of the brain for a fire skink is different. But yet, you would say that skinks are probably smarter than a beardy. And see, this is where we're getting into. So this first measurement is this way. Of the forebrain. So it's the front going back. So bearded dragons have a bigger forebrain because they match pretty similar to ball pythons. The forebrain of the blind species, of which makes so much sense. Blind species. So these are sea turtles. This really gives you a really good example of a blind species, even though it has an eye. It's basically a blind species. The regular sea turtles have the three humps: forebrain, optic tantrum, cerebellum. This, and then you have the OL stalk here in front. This over here has this is the leatherback sea turtle, which has the biggest range of anybody in the world, any reptile in the world, basically. So we have the OL stalk leads in, and it looks like a pile of shit with a dinghy hanging out of it, because it's basically a blind species where these other guys have actual coral to map their whole territory, so they can look around and map everything out accordingly to it. The actual sea turtle itself it doesn't get that. The leatherback has a deep dark ocean, so it has nothing to map. So it doesn't have the optic tantrum quite right, and so it looks like a pile of poo. This shows you how much is dedicated to sight. So for this thing, the worm lizard to have as much forebrain is because it's blind. And so they're measuring the distance. So it won't have one that actually curves. It'll have one with a lot of distance. And it just shows you that how little brain power we need if we don't have sight. So then you get your yellow-bellied sea snakes. They have a bigger forebrain. And then your skinks and your dwarf. I still can't believe this one. This one is such an outlier. The Cape Dwarf chameleon is such an outlier. It's been such a fascinating, look. Your collared lizard, your olive skink, and then, your Jackson chameleons down here. Your tokay geckos even further down. So these guys are all about the same size. Rainbow boa, compared to a collar lizard, has the same similar size and forebrain going back, so lengthwise. It's really fascinating. Whereas leopard gecko is the same lengthwise. A lot of these guys are very similar in length. Your flying dragon actually comes down even further, and the tokay gecko is even further a little bit in length. So it's actually less length. Same thing for your corn snake. but the differences in size is massive because that rainbow boa is not small. You know, this is a 3-foot lizard with tail, so it's about a foot long. The legless. So it's really fascinating when you look at it like that, because when you connect these two together, it doesn't make any sense for their intelligence yet. And so we need to change something here, and we'll look at that here in a minute. So when we're just comparing size, it doesn't really fit yet. So forebrain side view. So where this is, your forebrain. So now what we're doing is we're looking from this angle. From the side view of it. Once again, the ball python, Jackson chameleon. So it's like reversed almost for some of these guys, showing you that length. So what we find in the viper is that this hurts the connections. So the more the brain, the forebrain has connections between both hemispheres, the more creative the animal can be, because it's a shorter distance for the connection between it. And one side has your memory and one side has your imagination. And so what happens is that creativity is a mixture. It should be defined as a mixture of imagination and memory. And so this should actually be a very clear indicator of something. So sea snakes and bearded dragon. So it's just like it completely changes so much. So these skinks, think of how much smaller these skinks are. And these worms and stuff, where the tokay gecko. See how small the tokay gecko's forebrain is? That's why it makes trouble making better decisions, I guess is how you would say that. Whereas we can see that skinks have longer brains than they do the width-wise, showing that they actually have a better option here, like the fire brain here. The two connect better, and that OL stalk stretched it, so therefore they have more room per size. Hi, Nubs. What are you playing around about, buddy? Yeah, he's like, I got fingers. I got fingers over here. Where's fingers? So it shows you the connections here do have an impact on the way they think. And so we'll change this graph around here in a bit. So I think this is really fascinating that we can see the forebrain, it changes from width to size. But now the next forebrain model is based off of, since the snake brain's different, it's actually based off of this. So going across here. And so we're going to look at that size going that way to help kind of explain this. So going boom, boom. Okay. So, man, once again, you pop up that dwarf chameleon. So it shows that the yellow-bellied sea snake So this yellow-bellied sea snake, see how it looks here? So once again, it looks similar to a ball python. Well, we have the Jackson chameleon, looks much similar to a bearded dragon. We have that slow worm. Look how just like it looks like bags. So the glass lizard, once again, it looks like bags, like a similar to the skink here. Really shows you this Cape chameleon. Man, they're just massive bubbles. They're really cool, very interesting. How it fits in the brain, and the size is pretty wild how big it is compared to like a Jackson chameleon. So the cross section of the skinks seems to be bigger than the leopard gecko and bearded dragons and collared lizard. And then once again, the tokay gecko's down here. So these are really fascinating how these things set up. Having that smaller cross section is interesting. Man, that tokay just sits down in here, which explains so much of its behavior. So let's go look at the optic tantrum real quick, and then we'll come back to trying to solve this. Because that's the last one I've got. Your optic tantrum is this thing. Right above that red spot, it's this actual blue spot right here. This green spot. And so this actually helps us explain why there's cross threads here. The cross threads are because their optic tantrum are actually very small for snakes because they use their taste more. They use their OL stalk more because they're bigger OL stalks. And so their sight and OL stalks are combined together to make how they think. And then we can see these guys. So it's still wild that this guy's here. And so you can see these guys would be more apt to use their eyesight more. And so the difference in percentile of the brain here, there's a big question here because there's spots of the, when I did a video before, there's spots of the tokay gecko that are dramatically different. They're small spots in the optic tantrum that are just dramatically different in size. So the forebrain smaller and the optic tantrum smaller in the tokay gecko, which explains so much. But, you know, this guy shouldn't have, he's basically almost a blind species. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have an optic tantrum. And the way they measure their optic tantrum's a little weird. So this guy probably doesn't have the optic tantrum that they say he does, but we're not looking at it as another hump because he won't have another hump. His brain will almost be flat, very similar to the leatherback sea turtle. So you have one of the biggest turtles in the world brain is similar to a brain of a worm snake or a worm lizard, and then it's actually flat. So they're measuring the flat surface, but they're not actually really measuring from what they probably should. So that one I think is wrong on their study. I think their study misidentified the optic tantrum in those, or the data is weird because their brains are so much different. They should not have the humps. I don't think this is the Lebanon worm lizard. I don't think this is the same as the slow worm lizard. I don't believe so. I believe they're two different species. But we can see that this, goes back, and these are so much more massive than these are. And these are your optic tantrum backs here. And these are just so much bigger. And yet this thing's probably not that big. So it's really fascinating. So when we take this in consideration, then we might actually start moving these around. So we know the bigger percentile. So these guys have a bigger percentile of OL or optic tantrum than these guys do. So when we take that in consideration and the percentile of the brain, we could probably move the skinks. So when we look at percentile of the brain, since you're looking at, 30% of the OL stock in snakes compared to 20 to 25% in probably skinks, going down to less than that for your lizards, for your chameleons and beardies and dragons and geckos. So we look at that. Okay. So if we look at the stretch, we actually should be so the stretch due to the OL stock. Oh, that's his foot. I thought he was peeing. It felt wet. So when we look at percentiles here, we should see a bigger stretch in the way these two connect, because they're used more for certain species over other ones. So the size of a corn snake is massively different than a lot of these other ones. So yeah. So the OL stock's pretty small on these guys. So the length of the forebrain is affected. So then you have your skinks up here that should have a longer forebrain. But then, so when we move that, So it's a bigger percentile dedicated to the length of the forebrain and the connections. So the viper, like we said before, so the way it fits in the brain, in the skull, we can clearly see that it's not really stretched. So the length of the viper is not really that big. So you're not getting that connection between the imagination and the freaking memory like you would in other animals. So these guys would actually have less percentile dedicated to the length, whereas lizards would have more, but they don't really have that much dedicated to the length. And so now we have the side view. That really opens up a lot right here. This side view is actually one of the more important aspects of seeing how they kind of group together better. We can get rid of that one. Because their brains are so dramatically different in the way the side works. So the way the brain links. So therefore, these guys are smaller, but yet they'll have actual, in the snakes, they'll actually have that because their optic tantrums are so much smaller that their forebrain tries to wrap around it. Like I said, so as we look, you can see these goes almost flat against it for this, the European legless lizard, not for the viper. So this one also, the snake looks more like lungs because the smaller OL or the optic tantrum is smaller, so it wraps around it, decreasing between the two. So it makes it harder for these guys to be creative compared to a lizard. And so this really does help to explain a lot of their stuff. But because these things aren't stretched from the OL stalk in your Jackson chameleon, they also don't have as much percentile between. It just doesn't stretch it. So the more information you have coming in, the stretching of the brain, the forebrain, but allowing it to continue between the two hemispheres better, meaning better connections and better connections with the optic tantrum. This is why monitors and skinks seem to be some of the smartest on the planet of reptiles. Because they're in between. Like they're so, when we look at it, they're either at the top or they're in the middle when it comes to the size of their forebrains and stuff, when they're so much smaller than a lot of the other lizards. So this is why they have potential for imagining things, to develop things. I hope that really helps. I'm so pretty. I'm so pretty. I'm just so pretty. She's very pretty, aren't you, girl? Yeah. She's like, I want on top of the head again. She's so pretty. Prestige, everybody. So I hope this has helped a little bit here. But yeah, I gotta go. I gotta go help US Art today. And I really hope this kind of makes sense more, that the forebrain itself, the more connections there is in the forebrain due to stretching from the OL stock, so they have more information coming in from multiple sources, but yet the more connected it is in the forebrain actually tells you more about how intelligent, more creative in a way, so they can use their memory and imagination together better. This is why tag use and monitors you will see swaying back and forth as they stick their tongues out, because they're actually using both sides of the brain. And we do cross hemispheres, so your body will want to move in the opposite direction of what you're thinking. So the tongue flick is also the same thing. Up is memory, down is imagination. I really hope this was helpful to people to understand that these brains do. So if you want to understand the olive brain versus the fire skink brain, very similar brain, super similar brains. But yet the mandula is a little bit bigger on the fire skink compared to the cerebellum is a little bit bigger on the olive skink, because the olive is semi-arboreal while the fire skink is pretty much a species that just buries itself, terrestrial. So it has more sensitive information coming in, much like the ball python. And so it's very interesting how all that plays out, because the bigger the mandula, the less percentile of the brain is dedicated to forebrain. And so when we look at it like that, it starts to change how we see these things, because there's a reason why, oscillating skinks and friggin' emerald green tree skinks seem so similar, but just different enough, because the oscillating has more tactile sensory, I believe, than the emeralds do. So thank you all. Like, subscribe, and share. You guys have a good night.